She hasn't done a single thing worth being proud of. My uncle's voice filled the hearing room like smoke filling a closed space. Flat. Certain. The kind of voice that expects no argument. For a moment, no one moved. The ceiling fan above us turned slowly, clicking softly with every rotation. The magistrate looked up from the folder open in front of him. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at me. I kept my hands folded on the table. I kept my eyes forward. I didn't correct my uncle. I didn't shake my head. I simply sat there while the room decided what to think of me. Then the magistrate set down his pen and turned toward the attorney beside my uncle. "Counselor," he said, measured and quiet. "Before we continue, I'd like to ask you something." The attorney straightened. My uncle leaned back like a man who had already won. "Did your clients do any research on Miss Mitchell before filing this claim?" The attorney blinked. My uncle's wife turned her head slightly. And from somewhere behind me, I heard a sharp intake of breath from someone in the gallery who apparently already knew the answer. That moment didn't arrive without warning. It had been building for the better part of 2 months, ever since I drove back into Calhoun County for the first time in 6 years. Calhoun County sits in the eastern corner of Tennessee, wedged between 2 ridges that block out the late afternoon sun earlier than anywhere else I've ever lived. The town of Reidsville has one main road, a gas station that also sells worms and lottery tickets, a hardware store that has been in the same family for 4 generations, and a diner called Patsy's where people have been eating the same breakfast special since 1987. I had grown up there. I had also spent a long time trying to forget I had. I pulled into town on a Wednesday in late September, driving a truck that had seen better years. The leaves on the ridge were just beginning to turn, orange at the edges, still green in the middle. The kind of in-between that felt familiar. Everything about Reidsville was in between the past and whatever came next, between memory and the cleaner version of things people preferred to remember. I parked outside Patsy's because I needed coffee before I needed anything else. When I walked in, the bell above the door was the same bell that had hung there when I was 12 years old. Same pitch, same wobble. 3 tables turned to look at me. Donna, who had worked the morning shift at Patsy's for as long as I could remember, held her coffee pot in mid-pour and stared. Then she smiled carefully, the way people smile when they're genuinely surprised but trying not to show too much of it. "Sarah Mitchell," she said. "I'll be darned. Morning, Donna. You want the usual?" I almost laughed. The fact that she still remembered my usual, after 6 years, felt like both a comfort and a warning. "Please." I sat at the counter. The coffee came black and strong, the way it always had. A man 2 stools down glanced sideways at me without turning his head. I recognized him. Dale Pruitt, who had coached Little League when I was in middle school. He looked older, but then I suppose we all did. "You back to stay?" Donna asked, refilling her own cup. "For now," I said. The truth was more layered than that. I had come back because of a phone call I had received on a rainy Tuesday night 3 weeks earlier, while I was sitting in the break room at Station 7 Inches Knoxville going through the week's schedule. The number on my phone was one I hadn't seen in a long time. It belonged to a woman named Irene Cross, who had been my grandfather's neighbor for 30 years. "Sarah," she had said, "I'm so sorry to have to tell you this. Your grandfather passed this morning." I had sat very still for a long moment. My grandfather, Harold Mitchell, had been the one person in my family who never looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. He had a woodworking shop behind his house where he built furniture from scratch and let me sit on an overturned bucket and watch for hours when I was small. He called me by name without any weight behind it. Just my name, like it meant something good. Irene told me he had left a will. He had left the house and the shop and the half-acre of land behind it to me. I already knew, before she finished the sentence, that this would not sit quietly with the rest of my family. My father had 3 brothers. The youngest was Gary, who had stayed in Calhoun County his whole life, who had borrowed money from my grandfather more times than anyone kept track of, and who had been openly certain since I was a teenager that I would never amount to anything worth mentioning. Gary had a wife named Pamela who shared his opinions loudly, and a son named Bryce who had inherited the same certainty without the years to earn it. When I arrived at my grandfather's house 2 days after driving into town, I was sitting on the back porch looking out at the workshop when I heard a car in the driveway. 2 cars, actually. My father's sedan and Gary's truck, arriving within minutes of each other. I had not spoken to my father in nearly 4 years. The last conversation had ended with him telling me that the choices I was making were embarrassing to him. I had not asked which choices specifically. I already knew the category. I stood up before they reached the porch. My father came first. He looked tired and thin in the way people look when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time. He nodded at me more than he looked at me. "You made it," he said. "I did." Gary came around from the other side of the truck with Pamela close behind him. He didn't bother with a greeting. He looked at the workshop the way a man looks at something he has already decided is his. "You know," he said, "your grandfather talked to me about this property. Before he got sick." "Then he should have put that in the will," I said. Gary's jaw tightened. He wasn't thinking clearly at the end. Irene Cross said he was sharp until the last week. Gary looked at me then with something flat and cold behind his eyes. "You've been gone 6 years, Sarah. You don't know what it was like here." That was true. I didn't know what it had been like, but my grandfather had known what it was like wherever I was, because we had written letters. Old-fashioned paper letters, which I had saved every one of. Gary didn't know about the letters. No one in my family did. My father cleared his throat. "Maybe there's a way to settle this without making it complicated," he said. I looked at him. "The will is clear, Dad." He rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth. "Gary needs the property, Sarah. He's got debts." "I know about the debts," I said. Grandpa knew too. That sentence landed harder than I intended. Gary took a step toward me. "I want you to sign it over," he said. "I want you to do the right thing for this family for once in your life." There it was. I had been waiting for it since the moment I saw his truck pull in. I took a breath. "I'll see you in court," I said. Gary stared at me for another moment. Then he turned and walked back to his truck, and Pamela followed, and my father stood between us looking like a man caught in weather he hadn't prepared for. Before he left, he turned back once. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. I watched him go without answering. The filing arrived 11 days later. The first thing people learn when they return to a small town is that silence travels faster than sound. By the time I walked into Patsy's the morning after receiving the court papers, Donna had already heard the outline of it and was working on the details. She set my coffee down and looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for things she found genuinely unfortunate. "Gary filed on you?" I wrapped both hands around the mug. "He did." She made a sound low in her throat. "That man has had his eye on Harold's shop for 15 years. "I know. You going to fight it?" "I'm going to show up," I said. Dale Pruitt was at the counter again. He didn't look up from his eggs, but I noticed his spoon paused over his coffee for a second longer than necessary. The court date was set for 5 weeks out. 5 weeks in Reedsville with a contested will hanging over me meant 5 weeks of careful conversations and careful silences, and the particular weight of a small town forming its opinion. I spent most of those weeks at the house. My grandfather had left things orderly. He was that kind of man. The shop was clean. His tools were hung where they belonged, and there was a half-finished rocking chair in the corner that he had been building for no one in particular, just because he liked the process. I started fixing what needed fixing. There was a gutter on the north side of the house that had pulled loose from its bracket. A section of fence along the back of the property needed new posts. The work helped. It always had. One afternoon, an older woman named Mrs. Garrett from 2 houses down walked over with a plate of biscuits and more questions than the biscuits could soften. "I heard your uncle's taking you to court over Harold's place," she said, handing me the plate. "That's right." She shook her head slowly. "Harold told me he was leaving that shop to you, you know. Told me clear as day about 2 years ago. Said you were the only one who ever really understood what he built out there." I looked at the workshop. The windows were dusty from the outside. I had already started cleaning them. "He never told me that," I said. She looked at me sideways. "Harold wasn't a man who needed to say things twice. He figured you already knew." 3 days before the hearing, I was replacing the fence posts along the back property line when a car I didn't recognize pulled up along the road. A man got out and introduced himself as Cliff Barnett, the attorney representing my uncle and my father. He had the kind of practiced pleasantness that certain attorneys develop, where nothing they say sounds hostile even when every word of it is. He handed me a card and looked out at the property with what I can only describe as professional curiosity. Miss Mitchell, he said, my clients want you to know there are no hard feelings in this. I kept working. That's considerate of them. They simply feel that the property would be better placed with family members who have maintained a presence in this community. I set down my post-hole digger and looked at him. I am a family member, he smiled patiently. Of course, but you've been absent for 6 years. That's not a criticism, just a fact the court will consider. I picked up my digger again. There's another option, he said, a quiet settlement. Sign the property to Gary, and this goes away. I'll see you at the hearing, I said. His smile held. All right then. He drove away, and I watched the dust settle on the road, and I thought about my grandfather's letters, which I had read twice since arriving in town, and which I had brought with me in a manila folder inside the house. That night I sat at the kitchen table and read them again. My grandfather had a plain way of writing. No extra words, no performance. He wrote about the shop and the weather and the way the ridge looked in different seasons. He wrote about missing me and being proud of me and about how some people, he said, carry more than they let on. And that was never a weakness, even when other people treated it like one. I folded the letters carefully and put them back. Then I took out the other documents I had brought and reviewed them one more time. I had not told anyone in Reedsville what I did for a living. Not Donna. Not Mrs. Garrett. Not Dale Pruitt. I had not corrected anyone when they assumed I had been away working some unremarkable job in some unremarkable city. It had not seemed necessary. The truth, I had learned, tends to surface on its own. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in the Calhoun County Courthouse, a square brick building that smelled of pine cleaner and old carpet. I arrived early. The hearing room was smaller than a formal courtroom, with a long table at the front for the magistrate and 2 smaller tables facing it. A wooden railing separated the front from the gallery behind. By the time the session was called to order, a fair number of people from town had come to observe. Calhoun County had 4 courtrooms and 1 gossip cycle, and they often operated at the same speed. My uncle and aunt sat at the left table with Cliff Barnett. My father sat beside them. He had barely looked at me when I came in. Gary watched me take my seat with the expression of a man who considers a thing already settled. I had no attorney. Just a folder of documents and whatever I had learned from 6 years of showing up to difficult things without much backup. Barnett noticed immediately. He leaned toward Gary and said something quietly. Gary almost smiled. Barnett stood first when the magistrate, a compact man named Lawrence Voss, who had the steady, unhurried manner of someone who had seen every version of family disagreement, indicated he was ready. Your Honor, Barnett began, this is a matter of a contested estate. My clients, Mr. Gary Mitchell and Mr. Frank Mitchell, both brothers of the late Harold Mitchell, have reason to believe the distribution of assets in the existing will does not reflect Mr. Harold Mitchell's true intentions, and may have been the result of influence exerted at a time when the deceased was not at his full capacity. He laid it out methodically. My grandfather's age at the time he signed the revised will. The fact that I had been absent from Calhoun County for 6 years. The fact that Gary had been the one managing repairs on the property, paying property taxes on Harold's behalf during periods of difficulty, and maintaining a close relationship with the deceased in his final years. He was careful not to say anything openly hostile about me. He didn't need to. My uncle was less patient. When Magistrate Voss invited him to address the room, Gary stood and squared his shoulders like a man who had been rehearsing. I want to be respectful here, he said. Which, in my experience, is what people say right before they aren't. But the truth is that Sarah left this family. She left this county, she left her grandfather, and she didn't look back. We were the ones here. We drove Harold to his appointments. We showed up for holidays. We were present. He paused and looked at me briefly. I'm not saying she's a bad person. I'm saying she made her choices, and those choices meant she wasn't here. And now she shows up wanting what the rest of us worked to protect. My father nodded beside him. A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats. My Aunt Pamela had her hands folded in her lap and her chin raised at an angle that communicated absolute certainty. Then Gary added it. The sentence that hung in the air the way my uncle probably intended it to. She's never done a single thing worth being proud of, he said. She never served this community. She never built anything. She never gave this family a reason to brag. She just took off and let the rest of us handle things. He sat back down. Barnett gave a small, careful nod. Magistrate Voss made a note and looked toward me. "Miss Mitchell," he said. "You're representing yourself?" "Yes, sir." A polite murmur from somewhere in the gallery. My uncle looked quietly satisfied. Magistrate Voss looked at me for a moment with the patient, assessing expression of a man who has learned not to form conclusions quickly. "You may respond." I stood up. I did not look at Gary. I kept my eyes on the magistrate. "My grandfather wrote his will clearly," I said. "I have a copy, along with documentation of our correspondence over the past 6 years. I also have records that speak to my grandfather's state of mind and his reasons for his decision." I reached into my folder and pulled out the stack of papers I had organized the night before. Letters, money orders I had sent to help with taxes and repairs on 2 occasions when he had mentioned the strain in his letters. And one other document, which I had brought not to argue my case but because it was part of who I was and could not honestly be separated from anything else. "I'd like to submit these to the court," I said. Magistrate Voss nodded toward the clerk. "Bring them forward." I walked to the clerk's table and placed the folder down. Barnett glanced at the stack. My uncle's eyes followed mine as I returned to my seat. Magistrate Voss began reviewing the documents. The room settled into that particular quiet that forms when something is about to change but no one knows yet which direction. Barnett checked his watch once. My aunt smoothed her skirt. My father stared at the table. Then Magistrate Voss paused. He had reached the last document in the folder. He looked at it for longer than he had looked at the others. His expression didn't shift dramatically, just a slight stillness, the kind that comes when something registers that you weren't expecting. He set it down and looked up at the room. Then he looked at Barnett. "Counselor," he said, "before you make further arguments about this woman's character, I'd like to ask you something." Barnett stepped forward with the smooth confidence of a man who had won routine cases for 20 years. "Of course, Your Honor. Did your clients do any research on Miss Mitchell before filing this claim?" Barnett's posture changed almost imperceptibly. He glanced at Gary, then back at the magistrate. "My understanding," he said carefully, "is that she is the respondent in this matter." Magistrate Voss looked at him over the rim of his reading glasses. "That's not what I asked." My uncle leaned forward. My father frowned. Behind me, I heard someone in the gallery draw a quiet breath. Magistrate Voss lifted the document and held it so the room could see it was official, sealed, printed on the letterhead of an organization that people in rooms like this recognized. "Miss Mitchell," he said, turning to me, "this document indicates you are a certified paramedic and structural firefighter with Station 7 Inches Knox County, currently ranked as a lieutenant." The room went very still. "It further indicates," he continued, setting the document down, "that you received the Tennessee Fire Commission's Medal of Valor 18 months ago following an incident in which you entered an unsecured burning structure and removed 2 children before the roof collapsed." No one spoke. I heard my aunt inhale sharply. Magistrate Voss looked at Barnett. "Your client said, on the record, that Miss Mitchell has never done a single thing worth being proud of and has never served this community." He let that sit for a moment. "I want to give your clients an opportunity to revisit that statement." Barnett turned toward Gary. Gary's face had gone from settled certainty to something I had never seen on him before. He looked at me the way people look when they realize they have been arguing about a painting without noticing that the artist was standing beside them. "She never told us," he said. His voice came out smaller than his posture suggested. Magistrate Voss looked at me. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "is there a reason this wasn't raised earlier?" I thought about that. The real answer was simple. "Because it didn't feel relevant to who owns the shop," I said. My grandfather had never needed me to be decorated. He had needed me to show up when I could, to write when I couldn't, and to remember that the rocking chair was still waiting to be finished. My medal was not why he left me his property. The magistrate nodded slowly. "That's fair." Behind me, a woman whispered something to the person beside her. Across the room, I saw Dale Pruitt, who had apparently come to watch, press his lips together and look at the floor the way people do when something moves them more than they expected. My father had stopped looking at the table. He was looking at me. His expression was one I had not seen from him in a very long time, maybe ever. Confusion, yes, but underneath it, something cracking open. My uncle had not moved. Pamela had reached over and put her hand on his arm, but he hadn't reacted. He was still looking at me with that expression of a man whose version of a story has just been taken out from under him. Magistrate Voss straightened the papers in front of him. "I want to be clear," he said, addressing both tables. "A person's professional record does not determine inheritance. The law is the law regardless of what someone has or hasn't accomplished." He looked at Barnett. "However, when character is publicly questioned in a probate proceeding, it is this court's responsibility to ensure that the characterization is accurate. And it was not." Barnett adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, my clients were unaware. That is evident," the magistrate said, "and it is exactly the problem." He looked out at the room for a moment. I don't know what he saw in the faces there. I couldn't turn around. But something shifted in the air, the way air shifts in a room when the weather outside has changed and the windows are still closed. "We'll take a 10-minute recess," Magistrate Voss said. The gavel came down once. Chairs scraped. Voices started low and then built. I stayed where I was. During the recess, I kept my hands on the table and looked at nothing in particular. A man in the gallery, older, wearing a blue work shirt, walked slowly past on his way to the hallway and paused beside my table. He looked down at me with a straight, simple expression. "Paramedic?" he asked quietly. "And firefighter," I said. He nodded once with the particular economy of motion that people who have done hard physical work develop over years. "My son's at Station 4 Inches, Memphis," he said. He didn't say anything else. He kept walking. It wasn't a speech. It didn't need to be. Across the room, Gary hadn't stood up. He was still seated at his table, and Barnett was crouched beside him, speaking in low tones with the expression of an attorney who is recalculating. My father had turned in his chair so that his side faced me rather than his back. It was a small adjustment, but I noticed it. Pamela was looking at her phone. I didn't know what she was searching. After 10 minutes, the bailiff called the room back to order. Magistrate Voss returned to his seat and adjusted his papers with the methodical calm he had maintained throughout. "All right," he said. "Let's return to the matter." Barnett rose again. His tone had changed in the way a man's tone changes when the ground he was standing on has turned out to be less solid than he thought. "Your Honor," he said, "while the court has received additional context regarding Miss Mitchell's background, the substantive question before this hearing remains the validity of the will. My clients contend that Mr. Harold Mitchell's decision may have been influenced by correspondence and communication he was having with Miss Mitchell during a period when his faculties were diminished." The magistrate looked at him. "And your evidence for diminished capacity?" Barnett hesitated. "My client's observations of his condition." "Your client's opinions," the magistrate said evenly, "are not evidence of incapacity." "Has a medical professional made such a finding?" Barnett was quiet for a second longer than was comfortable. "No, Your Honor." "Then we are looking at a valid will," Magistrate Voss said. He turned to me. "Miss Mitchell, would you like to address the court before I issue my finding?" I stood. This time I did look at my uncle, and then at my father. Not with heat. Just steadily, the way you look at something you have spent a long time carrying. "My grandfather and I wrote letters for 6 years, I said. "I have 53 letters from him in a box in my truck. He knew what I did for a living. He knew where I had been. He asked about my shifts and he told me about the chair he was building, and he said he was proud of me in almost every letter." I paused for a moment. He was not a confused man. He was a clear man who made a clear decision, and he made it because he trusted me to take care of what he built. Barnett opened his mouth. The magistrate raised a hand slightly. "Counselor." Barnett closed his mouth. Magistrate Voss looked at both tables. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "This case is, at its root, about a family that stopped communicating and then arrived in a courtroom surprised by the result." He folded his hands together. "That is not uncommon in probate disputes. It is almost always painful. And it is almost never actually about the property." My uncle looked at the table. My father looked at his hands. "The will is clear," the magistrate continued. "Harold Mitchell left his home and workshop to his granddaughter Sarah Mitchell. The court finds no evidence of undue influence or diminished capacity. The will stands as written." The gavel came down once, a soft sound, like a door closing on one thing and opening, very quietly, on something else. The room took a few minutes to empty. People filed toward the back, and low voices filled the hallway. I gathered my folder slowly. My hands were steady. They usually were after things were settled. There is a particular stillness that comes after something difficult ends. Not relief exactly, more like the absence of pressure, the way your shoulders feel after you've set down a bag you'd been carrying for hours. Across the room, Barnett was packing his briefcase with the focused efficiency of a man who wanted to leave. He paused once and looked at me and gave a small, acknowledging nod, the kind that means I understand now even if I didn't before. Then he left. Pamela stood and gathered her coat and handbag and walked out without speaking. Then it was the three of us, my uncle, my father, and me. Gary had not moved from his chair. He sat with both hands flat on the table in front of him, staring at the wood grain. My father stood slowly and pushed his chair in, the way he always did, even when we were fighting, because he was particular about chairs. He looked at me, and there was something in his face that I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. He looked tired and uncertain and, beneath all of that, ashamed. Not performed shame, real shame, which is quieter and harder to look at. "Sarah," he said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't." He looked at the folder in my hands. "A Medal of Valor," he said. The words seemed to cost him something. "When did that happen?" 18 months ago. He rubbed the back of his hand across his mouth. "Your grandfather knew?" "Yes." My father was quiet for a moment. Behind him, Gary finally looked up. I had not seen my uncle uncertain since I was a child, and even then it had only lasted a second before he rebuilt his certainty. Now the uncertainty was just sitting there on his face with nowhere to go. "I didn't know any of it," Gary said. His voice was lower than usual, more careful. "You never told anybody." I looked at him. "When would I have told you, Gary? The last time you saw me before this week, you told me I was a waste of Harold's time." My uncle had no answer for that. He looked back at the table. My father stepped closer to my side of the room, which was itself a movement. "We should have asked," he said. That was as close to an apology as my father had come in a very long time, and I had learned, somewhere in the years between when I left and when I came back, that some people reach for an apology the way they reach for something on a high shelf. They have to work just to get there. "No," I said. "You should have." But I said it without the weight behind it I might have carried before. Because I had also learned something else. That being right about a wound doesn't make it stop hurting any sooner. My uncle stood up eventually. He came over to my side of the room slowly, the way a person moves when they are not entirely sure of their footing. He stopped about 2 feet away and looked at me with the expression of a man who has spent a long time telling a story that has just turned out to be wrong. "I shouldn't have said what I said about you," he told me. "In front of the court. I shouldn't have said it." He was not a man who found those words easily. I could see it cost him. "No," I agreed. "You shouldn't have." "I was angry," he said. "I thought I was owed something." He looked out the window toward the parking lot. "Harold talked about you all the time. I think that's part of it. I think I was jealous of a man who was proud of a person I'd already decided didn't deserve it." That sentence was honest enough that I had to take a moment with it. My father was listening from behind Gary, and his expression shifted slightly when Gary said it, like something falling into place. I thought about the workshop, the unfinished rocking chair in the corner, the smell of sawdust that had lived in that building for 30 years and would probably live there for 30 more. "You can still come by the property," I said. Both of them looked at me. "I'm not locking the family out of it." "That's not what Grandpa wanted either." Gary rubbed his jaw. My father looked at the floor. "The chair he was building," I said. "I want to finish it. I don't really know what I'm doing with wood. I'll need some help." A long pause. My uncle nodded once, slowly, like a man receiving something he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he'd earned. "I know a few things about wood," he said. "Harold taught both of us." "I know," I said. We walked out of the courthouse together. The afternoon had turned cool, and the sky over the ridge was the deep blue of late October. A few people lingered on the steps and along the sidewalk across the street. Small towns don't change quickly, but the way people see you can change in a single afternoon. I noticed Dale Pruitt standing near the bottom of the steps. He gave me a look that required no translation. The woman beside him, who I didn't know, said something to him quietly after we passed, and he said something back, and whatever he said made her look over at me with a different kind of expression than the one she had been wearing all morning. My father stopped beside his car. He looked at me with the uncertain, careful expression of a man who has more to say and doesn't know how to begin. "Can we come by?" he asked. "The house?" "Yes," I said. "I'd like that." He nodded. He got in his car. Gary had walked to his truck and was standing beside the driver's door, looking at nothing in particular across the parking lot. Before he got in, he turned back. "The chair," he said. "I know how Harold wanted the joints. He showed me once." "Good," I said. "We'll need that." He got in his truck and drove out first. My father followed. I stood in the parking lot for a moment, watching them go. With the late afternoon light on the ridge above town and the faint smell of leaves and wood smoke in the air, which is the smell of October in that part of Tennessee, and which I had carried in my memory for 6 years without always knowing it was there. I walked to my truck. The folder of documents was on the passenger seat. I left it there. I didn't need them anymore. What I needed was back at my grandfather's house, the gutter that still needed reattaching on the north side, the fence post on the far corner that I hadn't gotten to yet, and the unfinished rocking chair in the workshop, waiting in the corner with the patience of something built by a man who understood that not everything gets completed in a single season. Some things take the right people, at the right time, working together, which is usually later than anyone planned, but not too late if you're still willing to pick up the tools. That Sunday, I was on the porch with my coffee when I heard the rattle of my uncle's truck on the road. Behind it, my father's car. They parked and got out. My father had a bag from Patsy's in his hand. Gary had his toolbox. Nobody made a speech about it. My father set the bag on the porch rail. Gary looked at the north gutter and said it needed a longer bracket, which was true, and that he had one in the truck, which he apparently did, because he went and got it. We worked through the morning. I handed up tools. My father cleaned the gutters from the other end while Gary reattached the bracket. At noon we sat on the porch and ate from the bag my father had brought, and we talked a little, not about the hearing, about smaller things, about my grandfather, about the chair, about the ridge and the way the light changed on it by mid-October. At one point my uncle said, "He used to say that working with your hands was the only honest argument. I thought about that. He was right," I said. My father looked out at the workshop. "You want to start on the chair today?" he asked. I looked at the workshop. The afternoon light was already on the windows, which I had cleaned the week before, so they caught it properly. My grandfather had built that shop with his own hands 30 years ago, the same way he had built everything, slowly, carefully, with patience for the process. "Yeah," I said. "Let's start today."